Another example of the strict and moderate I wanted to touch on, at least briefly, is another one that's very relevant to our current situation is that the sort of theological controversies and that maybe happened in the early 20th century going on through and in the aftermath of Vatican II. And one thing that I really noticed is your comment that instead of trying to seek common ground with each other, the strict and moderate parties of the Orthodox Catholics would instead began to ally with the strict secular or the moderate secular, if that makes sense. So they would ally with people who were on their side in a sort of maybe political or broadly speaking ideological sense without being actually Orthodox Catholics. And that whenever the strict and the moderate are things start to break down, whenever the strict and moderate are preferring to ally with their secular counterparts rather than with each other within Christian unity. So can you talk about, not get into all the theological details of the different debates or anything, but just talk about some examples of how that's happened from maybe the early 20th century, the Thomists, traditional Thomists, the Nouvelle Theology, and then the parties at Vatican II and afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it starts with the basic theological truth that all true cultural and spiritual transformation comes from divine grace through the cultus that as instituted by Christ. And so there can't really be any common ground with non-Catholics that sort of supersedes one's own common ground with fellow Catholics, because that's the truth where we need to deal with every situation with our fellow Catholics, because God is working through the church to resolve these things. So this first starts to be a big issue. I mean, it's already in the French Revolution. You have half of the clergy sign on to the revolution. Pius VII reconciles them back, but does not require them to renounce what they had vowed. We have the counter-revolutionary movements against the liberal revolutionaries, who are monarchists, so they're defending all these monarchies. But a lot of these monarchies, the reason that they're revolting against these monarchies is because the monarchies are corrupt, and they're just, unfortunately, I mean, as bad as the French Revolution was, the French kings were tyrants, and so they were revolting against tyranny and overreacting in all of these liberal ways and evil ways. But the Catholic monarchists find common ground with the secular monarchists. And the secular monarchists don't really care about the Christian faith. They're just going through the motions to preserve their own power and preserve tradition and also that sort of thing. And so this is what makes communism susceptible to the masses, because the communists come along and say, oh, well, all you poor people, see, the church doesn't care about you. Clearly, they're just allying with all the power.
Right.
And what happens at Vatican I is that there's sort of these three parties. There's the heretical party, which totally rejects papal infallibility per se. But then there's this moderate party, like St. John Henry Newman, who says, yes, I believe in papal infallibility, but we shouldn't exaggerate that. And then there's the ultramontanists or the neo-ultramontanists or the hyper-uber-ultramontanist party, who wants to exalt, and they're allied with all the monarchists. So there's monarchy in the world and monarchy in the church. And so they actually start to ostracize this moderate party, who's this Orthodox party. Like St. John Henry Newman calls them the tyrant majority of Vatican I. And so after Vatican I is this period of, there's a lot of good things after Vatican I. There is a Thomistic revival. There's lots of good things that are happening, conversions, etc. But at the same time, there's also the Umberto Benigni, who headed up the Solidatium Pianum under Pius X and after him, under Benedict XV. Apparently, he was also persecuting everybody who was not a monarchist like him, as a modernist. And so he was wading into these sort of temporal authority controversies and imposing his political views on others. So this is what creates a situation which comes to a head in the 1940s and 50s with the Nouvelle Theologie aka ressourcement, whatever you want to call it. Some of those people don't like that term, but just for the sake of history, there is a debate that happens between those guys, like Henri de Lubac, people have heard of him, in France, with other French Dominicans as well as Roman Dominicans. And there's this tension that is created but never resolved. And we see ultimately the fruit of this sort of animosity that has been building since the 19th century, but had become acute since the First Vatican Council and Pius X and Umberto Benigni, not Bonini, Benigni. We have this backlash at Vatican II and after. We have a backlash against that excessiveness. And this is what helps explain what happened at Vatican II, because we have this the big issue was that before Vatican II, we had the Orthodox Catholic monarchists, whether ultramontanists or otherwise, allying with these secular forces. But then we have, at Vatican II, with the opposite thing happening. We have the ressourcement type thinkers who are Orthodox, like Ratzinger or Wojtyła, who are more or less allies, or at least they're willing to give a pass or not very strongly, harshly rebuke people like Hans Küng until a little bit later. He does get rebuked a little bit. But if you compare what, Hans Küng versus the treatment of Archbishop Lefebvre, I think that it is reasonable to argue that Lefebvre, he got his hand slapped pretty hard, whereas Hans Küng got a little bit. Hans Küng was definitely a heretic. He denied the infallibility of the Pope. He denied dogmas. Definitely a heretical force here, and he's teaching at a Catholic university for decades. And so there appears to be this animosity, and we can, if we even set aside Lefebvre and we just talk about like the Latin Mass, for example, why was there such a resistance to allow those forces at Vatican II? You had the conservative traditionalist bishops who felt isolated because they seemed to be trying to defend what came before against the united forces of the European alliance of the ressourcement, sort of the good guys, but also the bad guys. And they were kind of allied at Vatican II, and they were allied after. And that only after Vatican II, they break up into Concilium Journal and Communio Journal. But then we have this civil war between those parties that continues to this day.
Because it's in the implementation at Vatican II that people like de Lubac or Maritain or whoever are starting to see some of the really bad things that are happening and speak out against it. In some cases, quite strongly.
Yes, and Henri de Lubac says in 1967 that they are trying to create a new church other than the Church of Christ in the name of ecumenism, for example. So that's a pretty big that's a strong statement, of course. But I think that the answer should have been, hey, those rigid trad bishops that we mocked at Vatican II, why don't we join up with them, and then we can together we can fight this heretical depravity that has been vomiting forth in the church ever since all this started happening.
Right.
But I think that there is so much bad blood and animosity that these parties felt like they had to go it alone. And I think it's only now in the past decade or so that we've really seen a lot more of those two parties come together a lot more, because they see efforts that are not only against the Latin Mass, but we have efforts against the legacy of John Paul II, for example, at the same time. Right. Things like that. And so we have, wait, so what's going on here? This is we all agree on these basic things. Yeah. Something's happening, something's wrong. We all need to work together to work against it.
Right.